Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MSP. Ukraine War News Update, second part thereof for the 26th of June 2024. We start the military aid news with a couple of really big bits of news. I mean, significant. And they're both connected, one for each side. So the first is that the US is moving towards removing the ban of deploying military contractors to Ukraine for the first time in the war, which would help maintain and repair US military equipment in the country, according to CNN. This will help repair some of those maybe air defense weapons, maybe who knows exactly what it may entail. This is the information we get from CNN under the title of the article, Biden administration moves toward allowing American military contractors to deploy to Ukraine. So let's read some of this. The Biden administration is moving towards lifting a de facto ban on American military contractors deploying to Ukraine. Four US officials familiar with the matter told CNN to help the country's military maintain and repair US provided weapons systems. The change would mark another significant shift in the Biden administration's Ukraine policy as the US looks for ways to give Ukraine military an upper hand against Russia. The policy is still being worked on by the administration officials and not received final sign-off yet from President Joe Biden. Quote, we have not made any decisions and any discussion of this is premature, said one administration official. Quote, the president is absolutely firm that he will not be sending US troops to Ukraine. Once approved, the change would likely be enacted this year, officials said, and would allow the Pentagon to provide contracts to American companies for work inside Ukraine for the first time since Russia invaded in 2022. Officials said they hope it will speed up the maintenance and repairs of weapons systems being used by the Ukrainian military. Okay, so before we go on with that, it's really important to understand that this isn't going to be a case of getting military fighters, I don't think. Contractors is a broad term, and sometimes, when you talk about contractors in, say, Iraq, you get actually kind of not quite mercenaries, but paid up people who are working for private affairs that are subcontracted to the US government so that, things aren't so official. American military men aren't fighting in Iraq or they aren't paid up US military army, conventional army members of the armed forces. And so there's a lot of grey area and whatnot. But there are also a lot of contractors who are maintenance contractors who are working to fix up bits of kit, fix up an energy infrastructure, whatever. In terms of what would be the case in Ukraine, I'm sure it would be in terms of fixing Bradleys and fixing Patriots. And the problem is, if you get these pieces of kit like a HIMARS, right, and it goes wrong, then it has to be sent back to the US, and that takes that HIMARS out of action for an awful long time and is very expensive. It's much cheaper if you can get those people able to fix these bits of kit into Ukraine working there. And it's not as dangerous as one might think as well. We'll come on to that in a second. So the article continues. Administration officials began to seriously consider these restrictions over the last several months, officials said, as Russia continued to make gains on the battlefield and US funding for Ukraine stalled in Congress. Allowing experienced US government funded American contractors to maintain a presence in Ukraine means they will be able to help fix damaged high value equipment much faster, officials said. One advanced system that officials say will likely require regular maintenance is the F-16 fighter jet, which Ukraine is set to receive later this year. Companies bidding for the contracts will be required to develop robust risk mitigation plans to mitigate threats to their employees, an official said. The discussions follow a series of decisions the US has made in recent months to try to help Ukraine beat back the Russians. In late May, Biden gave Ukraine permission to strike targets inside Russia near the border with the Ukrainian city of Kharkiv with US weapons, a request the US had repeatedly denied in the past. Last week, the policy appeared to expand once again when National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan said Ukraine could counterstrike anywhere along the Ukraine-Russia border using US weapons. Current and former officials familiar with the discussions about deploying contractors to Ukraine emphasized that the policy change will not result in the kind of overwhelming American contractor presence that existed in Iraq and Afghanistan. Instead, it would likely result in anywhere from a few dozen to a couple hundred contractors working in Ukraine at a time. Quote, this would be much more focused and thoughtful effort to support Ukraine in country, said retired Army officer Alex Vindman, who served As the Director for European Affairs and former President Donald Trump's National Security Council, Vindman, has been pushing the administration to lift the restrictions for nearly 2 years and said the administration has been working on a plan to ease the restrictions since earlier this year. Quote, Ukraine is an ally, Vindman told CNN. The US has keen critical national security interests in supporting Ukraine, and there are plenty of risk mitigation measures. So the point is that it's going to be super beneficial for Ukraine. They aren't going to be on the front lines, and these are people that are going to be, I mean, there are risks, of course, that say they're working on F-16s, F-16 facilities get hit. Of course, that is going to be a vulnerability, a threat there. But as Jimmy Rushton here, who's a Kyiv-based foreign policy and security analyst, this makes perfect sense. And Ukraine is, as long as reasonable precautions are taken, a far safer environment for US contractors than Iraq or Afghanistan, where US contractors were deployed for nearly 2 decades. Of course, it's very, very similar, as in you've got a war zone where US contractors are working in benefit of US strategic objectives. That would be the case in Ukraine. And in fact, arguably, these people will be safer, back in Western Ukraine than they are and have been in Afghanistan and Iraq. It'd be interesting to know what the numbers of casualties for contractors in Iraq and Afghanistan are. I'm sure someone can let us know that. But anyway, that's really significant, would really help Ukraine out, and would also give a lot of permission to other nations to do similarly as well. So it's a really important move there from the US administration. Really significant, both in terms of what it does and the signals it sends to other allies. Now, on the other hand, and maybe as a result, maybe this has been put in the public domain because as part of the bilateral agreement between Russia and North Korea, the North Koreans have said that they are going to send an engineering team to the front lines, actually, or closer, or certainly into Ukraine. Here, Yahoo News says North Korean, well, this is actually Kyiv Independent, North Korean troops fighting in Ukraine would be cannon fodder, Pentagon says. So North Korean troops would be cannon fodder if they joined Russian forces on the battlefield in Ukraine. Pentagon spokesperson Pat Ryder said during a briefing yesterday, Russian President Putin and North Korean leader Kim Jong-un signed a strategic defense agreement between Moscow and Pyongyang on the 19th. As part of the alliance, the North Korean military has announced that its engineer unit would join Russian forces on the ground in Donetsk Oblast as soon as next month. So that is relatively close to the front line, if not serving the front line. I don't know whether it's going to be right back in Donetsk, but that is close. That's not the same as Americans going to Lviv or somewhere around there. I think that if I were North Korean military personnel management, I would be questioning my choices of sending my forces to be cannon fodder in an illegal war against Ukraine, Ryder said. Ryder said that the accelerating military cooperation between North Korea and Russia, including the possible deployment of North Korean troops in Ukraine, is, quote, something to keep an eye on. The agreement between Kim and Putin declares that, quote, in case any one of the two sides is put in a state of war by an armed invasion from an individual state or several states, the other side shall provide military and other assistance with all means in its possession without delay. That's really quite an exacting commitment there. So if South Korea invaded North Korea, Russia would have to immediately and with all means in its possession come to North Korea's aid. That's really significant. So South Korea must be pretty peed off about that. But likewise, like if Ukraine were to do an incursion into, like they have done with the Russian Defense Corps, into Russian territory, then technically North Korea would have to come to Russia's aid with all means in its possession. That's really significant. Following the pact, South Korea said it would reconsider supplying weapons to Ukraine. North Korea has emerged as a leading weapons supplier to Russia as Moscow faces reduced military stocks and production capacity simultaneously hampered by Western sanctions. Internal Russian trade data obtained by the Washington Post shows that Russia may have received $1.6 million artillery shells from North Korea over the course of 6 months. So this is causing lots of people to pick out these quotes from Pat Ryder, this is another really big piece of news. I think those two together need to be seen in the same context, and one might, in a sense, be not necessarily a reaction to the other, but at least being publicly submitted is a reaction against the North Korean bilateral agreement. Now, the German government is putting together another massive framework deal to purchase up to 2.35 million rounds of artillery ammunition. The deal with Diehl Defence and Nammo Raufoss would be worth up to 15 billion euros and would cover future orders for Ukraine as well. So German aid to Ukraine adds to what OSINT Technical was saying there with some details. So after an existing framework contract for artillery ammunition with Rheinmetall was recently increased to up to 8.5 billion euros, the German MOD is planning another record framework contract. According to Spiegel, this involves a framework contract for artillery ammunition worth up to 15 billion euros, that's 2.35 million artillery shells, which will be produced by Diehl Defence. And Nammo. One thing is likely to catch the eye here is a high price, almost 6,400 euros per 155mm shell. Just like in the case of Rheinmetall, the new framework contract is to be made available for the Bundeswehr, the German army, Ukraine, and all NATO partners. Following the conclusion of the framework contract, the Bundeswehr is planning an initial order worth 1.31 billion euros for 200,000 155mm shells. And just want to point out that Germany already has an existing framework contract with Diehl Defence and Nammo for up to 350,000 shells, which was concluded almost a year ago. According to Spiegel, only 5,000 artillery shells from this framework contract were called up last year. Therefore, very interesting to plan this massive additional framework contract now. What I don't know if that maybe German aid to Ukraine can help me out here, but does that mean that of the 3,500, 5,000 were manufactured last year, the contract's in place, and then that another 345,000 can be made, and who they are for, so on and so forth? I mean, well, actually, maybe it is already in here. So contracted 350,000 contract in December. I wonder if that's here in the delivery date. So all 24, summer 24 onwards, quarter 4 24, 24, 24, 25. So some of them throughout, all throughout this year. That's going to, so the 350,000 is, I don't know. I don't know the details there. So we'll have to see if German aid to Ukraine can reach out and give us some information on when all of this will be available to Ukraine and how much of that is for Ukraine and how much is for the Bundeswehr and others. Now, speaking of artillery ammunition being provided to Ukraine, the first shipment of artillery ammunition procured from non-EU countries under the so-called Czech initiative has successfully arrived in Ukraine, according to Petifiala, as I mentioned yesterday. But the addition here is further deliveries are planned for July, so they are due to get some more in July, and Ukraine is expected to receive around 500,000 rounds, so 500,000 rounds by the end of the year. And of course, you're taking into account what America is providing, what Germany is providing, what the EU is providing, possibly even Australia, UK, at least manufacturing. I don't know who eventually provides those. And then you've got South Korea possibly on the map as well. There are, or should be, quite a substantial number of artillery shells finding their way to the Ukrainian front line. Ukraine now produces more than 3,000 FPV drones per day, according to Forbes. And there will be more every day. We are proud to be a small part of it, says this concern. To get so this is Brennpunkt UA, together with Frontline Kit and Sumleni, who is just delivering the next batch to the front lines. 3,000 drones per day, FPV drones. So if that's correct, then that is 90,000 a month. That is an awful lot a year. We have heard differing numbers from the last, initially it was a case of Ukraine, not initially, but sometime back, it was Ukraine saying we are now producing 50,000 a month. And that was at the time that Russia also said, well, you're doing 50,000, we're doing 300,000. And you look at the stats from the front line, you're like, there's no way that Russia are producing 300,000 drones a month. 150,000 drones a month, because it looks like Ukraine are using more drones and they're having more successful drone hits. And all the stats lead one to believe that Ukraine, even at that stage, were outproducing Russia. I didn't believe that Russia had the drone advantage, even though some people on front line were saying that might have been the case, like anecdotally, and other analysts as well. But the stats seem to suggest that Ukraine had the advantage then. And even where they didn't have the advantage in certain areas, like on positions and buildings, the Russians were still using more drones than the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians are now overtaken them, as according to the Tochny data. So that was when they had 50,000. Well, now that was 50,000, maybe all drones. Now they've got 90,000 FPV drones. Then you've got IED dropping drones, Baba Yaga octocopters, reconnaissance drones, medium range attack drones, long range attack drones. So you can add to the 90,000 a month, if that really is just FPV drones, an awful lot of other types of drones. And so you probably are getting up to significant numbers over 100,000. And I don't think the Russians are competing with that. Now, the Russians are producing drones and the Ukrainians are getting attrited by Russian drones, of course. It's not an issue, but this is an asymmetry where Ukraine enjoy at the moment an advantage, and that needs to be kept. That it's such a significant component of the drone warfare that their advantage has to be maintained, the Ukrainians. But yes, significant numbers there, and that's really good news for the Ukrainians. Now, talking of drones, here's another thread from Arthur Rahe. And this is something I reported the other day, but let's look in a little bit more detail. So these are the Sea Baby drones that go and drop mines, and those mines are dropped in dropped in important waterways, such that they have supposedly caused the destruction or damage to 4 Russian vessels, on top of what we already knew, arguably. So another Ukrainian development related to sea drones has become known. Ukrainian sea drones have learned to mine the sea routes of Russian ships. Thanks to this tactic, 4 enemy vessels were sunk, as reported in the article by the Wall Street Journal. The Russians, frightened by the raids of sea drones, built large barriers at the entrance to the Sevastopol Bay. So the Ukrainians came up with an alternative operation, the installation of sea mines. Special Sea Baby have learned to install bottom mines made of plastic weighing about 180 kilograms. They are difficult to find since they lie in the silt under the shallow water, use acoustic and electromagnetic sensors to detect the presence of the ship, causing a detonation. For 1.5 months, a team of Ukrainian special services tracked the routes of sea ships and civilian transport before sending Sea Baby to install 2 mines. On September the 14th, the missile corvette Salmon was blown up by such a mine. Over the following week, Sea Baby laid about 15 more mines. During one of the flights, the drone opened fire with a grenade launcher on Russian Raptor-class patrol boats, damaging them. On October the 11th, the large patrol boat Pavel Derzhavin was damaged while entering Sevastopol Bay. It was limping into port for inspection. On October the 13th, the vessel was heading to another port for repairs when it hit a mine. A large tugboat sent to rescue the ship also blew up. A few days later, an explosion occurred on a modern mine countermeasure ship, one of 2 in Russian service. That's really interesting, that, and I wonder if the Russians now know about this, whether they can mitigate that, whether the surprise is now gone and the Ukrainians have to think about another way of destroying ships. But certainly seems to have been a really successful project, that, and one hopes it can continue. And indeed, I don't know whether they have the range to get all the way to Novorossiysk, but it'll be useful to mine that area as well, no doubt. Now, Latvia will transfer medical equipment worth almost 350,000 euros to Ukraine. That's good news from Latvia. Thank you very much. And then we go on to Russian drones here. And I've already shown you that Russians are working hard on UGVs. And now we're going to see Specialists of the Ukraine drone, so that's ground drones. Specialists of the UAV detachment Russian Hawks of the southern group of forces use automated platforms Scorpion M in a Donetsk direction. The automated ground complex, so actually this isn't UAVs, UGVs, again, is used to conduct terrain reconnaissance, trawling, brake and pressure sensors of anti-personnel mines and improvised explosive devices, and delivering standard destruction charges weighing up to 40 kilograms to enemy positions. With a weight of up to 20 kilograms, it has a high mobility and maneuverability when moving both over moderately rough terrain and in urban areas. The speed can reach 3.3 meters per second. The battery life from the built-in power supply unit is up to 4 hours. So here is
Вы видели роботизированную платформу, управляемую дистанционно. В принципе, ничего сложного в этих устройствах нет, просто от...
So we'll leave him banging on and just move to it here. And you can see fairly simple bit of kit, but they are producing a lot of these drones that have different capabilities, different functions. And as mentioned, this is pretty maneuverable, looks fairly cheap. We saw one the other day that was releasing smoke. Here's something that can deliver explosive charges, or indeed, work on demining and setting off anti-personnel mines and anti-tank mines itself with, I presume, charges. Anyway, there you go. That is what the Russians are doing in that with UGVs. There was, I did have one for Ukrainian UGVs. No, obviously I don't anymore. Oh no, it might be this one I was thinking of. So here is a video from the Russian, that this is the same source, showing a number of these. I mean, again, really simple, but they're obviously making them some kind of scale and are able to put them to good use. You're going to see more and more UGVs used over the course of not just this war, but indeed, warfare going forward, because better to lose one of those than a human being. Right, North Korea expects to receive long-range nuclear missile technology from Russia in exchange for the supply of artillery shells, according to the US Deputy Secretary of State Kurt Campbell. China fears that such cooperation could lead to war in Northeast Asia. This is one of these interesting dynamics that is going to upset South Korea, obviously, because they don't want North Korea getting that tech, and we talked about that before, and that's what's going to possibly cause the South Koreans to aid Ukraine a lot more explicitly and overtly there. But also, it might upset China. China has interest that Asia doesn't devolve into a nuclear war. Right, and so they've been really strong on Russia not using tactical nukes in Ukraine, possibly because they have control of 15% of the Ukrainian agricultural farmland, but also because they no one wants a nuclear war, right? And when you've got 1 billion people to look after and feed, you want to make sure nuclear war doesn't happen and that massive land areas don't become contaminated. And so, although you might think China might be supportive of Russia working in close cooperation with North Korea, they are also not huge fans of Russia, China, and they have an interesting relationship with North Korea. And so China might not be too supportive of such a close relationship between Russia and North Korea. Anyway, something to consider going forward. That's enough from me from this video. Take care of yourselves, guys. Speak soon. Toodle pips.